She turned into a nightmare for her whole family. Today, we'll delve into a grim case asking, what sustains a marriage devoid of love, trust, or basic respect? Some cling to marriage for their children's sake, others due to societal judgments or religious convictions. However, this pursuit to preserve a union at all costs can sometimes lead to tragic outcomes. The tale of Jacqueline and Paul Crimble, though not unique, captivated the public due to its sheer cruelty, greed, and cynicism. Labeled the Black Widow, Jacqueline was eventually imprisoned. Yet, her daughter revealed in a heartfelt interview that Jacqueline continued to wreak havoc, even from behind bars. Jacqueline, also known as Jackie Mary Bennett, was born on December 18, 1974, in County Armagh, Northern Ireland. The youngest of two, she grew up in a typical middle-class family. From an early age, Jackie was known for her erratic, spoiled, and sometimes aggressive behavior. As a teenager, her actions became increasingly unmanageable. Her family, attributing this to adolescence, hoped she would mature with time. During high school, Jackie met Paul Crimble, a young man 3 years her senior. Paul, from a devout and conservative family, was her complete opposite. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, they were drawn to each other. Paul, a modest, shy, and academically gifted student, found Jackie's boldness and confidence irresistible. She was likely the first and only girl he ever truly loved. Jackie's parents supported the relationship, believing Paul could temper their daughter's wild nature. To them, Paul became almost more of a family member than Jackie herself from their very first meeting. Conversely, Paul's parents were wary of Jackie, though they did not interfere with the relationship. School friends often commented on the couple's mismatched nature. Jackie was known to instigate conflicts and resolve them through aggression, whereas Paul always sought peaceful solutions. Known for his friendliness, responsibility, and maturity, Paul was the type who always kept his promises and was ready to assist anyone in need, embodying the qualities of a genuinely kind and mature individual. At the tender age of 17, Jacqueline found herself pregnant by Paul, her boyfriend. At that time, she was wrapping up her final school year, while 20-year-old Paul was already navigating college life. Confronted with the news, Paul didn't hesitate to propose marriage, ready to embrace full responsibility for both Jacqueline and their unborn child. Despite her uncertainties about motherhood and family life, Jacqueline saw no option but to proceed with the pregnancy. Abortion was inconceivable, especially given Paul's and his deeply religious family's views on the matter. Thus, Paul purchased an engagement ring and proposed to Jacqueline, who accepted. They celebrated their union with a simple wedding in 1992, surrounded by their nearest and dearest. Days before the wedding, Paul confided in his best friend about his apprehensions. He expressed doubts about Jacqueline's feelings and his own, revealing his fear of her volatile temper. He wondered if his feelings were more sympathetic and dutiful than truly loving, having never been with another woman for comparison. His friend, deeply concerned, advised against the marriage, fearing it might be a colossal mistake that could lead to lifelong unhappiness. Yet Paul, committed to the path he had chosen, believed fatherhood might transform Jacqueline into a gentler, more stable person. He clung to this hope, unaware of the harsh realities that lay ahead. In the starkness of a loveless marriage, the couple welcomed their first child, Danielle, in early 1993. 6 years later, they had a son, Adam. Paul, as the family's sole breadwinner, ensured they wanted for nothing. After Adam's birth, the Crimbles sought a more spacious living situation and purchased a cozy 3-bedroom townhouse in Armagh in 2000. By then, Paul had advanced to a senior mechanical engineer position, securing a comfortable income for his family. Jacqueline, Paul's wife, chose not to work, preferring instead to manage the household and care for their children. However, her efforts in both roles left much to be desired. Described as selfish, lazy, and quick-tempered, Jacqueline often displayed aggression towards her own children. As they grew older, she attempted to enter the workforce, but her quarrelsome disposition meant that her stints in employment were short-lived. Her evenings were predominantly spent at bars, consuming alcohol while Paul stayed home, tending to their son and daughter. Even when sober, Jacqueline was a challenging presence. Under the influence, she became downright volatile. She frequently initiated conflicts, engaged in physical altercations, and used foul language. Her inappropriate behavior with various men was met with aggression when she faced criticism or pleas for decorum, making her next move unpredictable. Neighbors and family friends, well aware of Jacqueline's antics, sympathized deeply with Paul and the children who bore the brunt of her erratic behavior. Living in a small, quiet town meant that Jacqueline's escapades were common knowledge, leading many to steer clear of her. This notoriety had repercussions for Paul and the children, who faced judgment and alienation from peers at school. Jackie's wild lifestyle was no secret. She frequented entertainment venues without any attempt at discretion. Her presence was a source of anxiety not only for other patrons, but also for the staff, who knew that trouble was sure to follow her. At home, the threat of Jacqueline's unpredictability kept her family perpetually on edge. Paul, despite his growing discomfort, rarely voiced his struggles. Friends, family, and colleagues could sense his unease, especially when his wife was mentioned. Many advised him to leave her, but Paul was haunted by the fear of losing access to his children. In any dispute, Jacqueline would immediately threaten to sever his ties with their daughter and son. Moreover, she intimidated him with the prospect of harm, leveraging her connections with dubious characters from the bars who were willing to commit crimes at her behest. Paul generally acquiesced to his wife's demands and opted to remain silent during conflicts. On the morning of June 20th, 2004, emergency services received a distressing call from a woman claiming she and her husband had been assaulted in their home. The caller, identified as Jacqueline Crimble, reported that 3 unknown assailants had entered their home, subjected them to physical violence, tied them up, attempted a robbery, and then fled with their car, abducting her husband in the process. Upon arrival at the scene, police and medical responders found Jacqueline with her hands secured behind her back with plastic cable ties, though her legs were unbound, suggesting she might have managed to partially free herself. Strikingly, Jacqueline exhibited no visible injuries or bruises, contradicting her initial report of a violent beating. The children were fortunately not present during the incident, having been sent to stay with their paternal grandparents for the weekend. Jacqueline recounted that the evening before, she and Paul had visited a bar to unwind. After returning post-midnight, as Paul unlocked the front door, 3 figures allegedly emerged from the shadows, forcing their way inside. The assailants, one brandishing a firearm, restrained the couple, assaulted them, and demanded money and illegal substances. Paul purportedly attempted to negotiate with the intruders, pleading for their release and promising not to alert the authorities. However, this only incited further violence. They struck Paul multiple times and began to suffocate him with a plastic bag in Jacqueline's terrified presence. Finding no cash or illicit substances, the intruders resolved to steal the couple's car. Mysteriously, they chose to abduct Paul, leaving Jacqueline tied up but otherwise unharmed behind them. After the criminals departed with Paul, Jacqueline managed to dial 911 using her tongue, desperately urging the detectives to find and rescue her husband, whom she believed might still be alive. Despite her apparent distress during the call, her demeanor struck the authorities as suspiciously composed. At the time, there was no immediate reason for the authorities to doubt her story, and the search for the couple's missing car was launched countywide. Meanwhile, investigators commenced a thorough examination of the crime scene, attempting to extract any possible details about the assailants. Jacqueline reported that the attackers wore masks, making it impossible for her to note any distinctive features such as clothing, speech impediments, or unusual gaits. She could only assert that there were 3 male attackers. By Monday morning, less than a day into the investigation, the Crimble family car was located abandoned just 3 miles from their home, parked in a deserted alley beside an empty house. Inside the trunk, authorities made a horrifying discovery: the mutilated body of Paul, showing signs of severe beating and torture. The 35-year-old's hands and legs were secured with cable ties, and his face and body bore extensive bruises. When Jacqueline was informed of this gruesome find, her reaction was unnervingly calm. The brutal demise of her husband, the father of her children, seemed to barely affect her. Her attempts to display shock and grief failed, as she did not shed a single tear, and within moments of receiving the news, inquired about the return of her car. Her peculiar behavior and lack of emotional response raised suspicions, compelling law enforcement to scrutinize the newly widowed mother more closely. Although initially taken at face value, Jacqueline's narrative began to unravel as her actions suggested she might be concealing the truth. As the investigation progressed, unsettling details about Jacqueline's personal life began to surface. It was revealed that her marriage to Paul had been deteriorating for years, and her role as a wife and mother was far from exemplary. Neighbors, acquaintances, and even her own children and parents spoke negatively about her. Additionally, it came to light that Jacqueline had been involved with Roger Ferguson, a local farmer, for several months. Roger, who lived with his mother on a farm in Armagh, was frequently seen with Jacqueline at various local entertainment spots, often drinking heavily. He was also known to visit her at her home when Paul was at work and the children were in school or daycare. Just a day after Paul's disfigured body was discovered, Jacqueline transitioned from a victim to the prime suspect, with Roger regarded as a potential accomplice. Jacqueline's demeanor during this period did not reflect that of a grieving widow. She seemed more concerned about retrieving her car than mourning her husband. Her story of an attack by a gang of armed addicts struck many as implausible, especially given the peaceful nature of their town and the absence of similar prior incidents. Furthermore, the supposed attackers left no traces, and no witnesses reported seeing any suspicious individuals in the area. Moreover, it emerged that Paul had an insurance policy worth £300,000, which Jacqueline would receive upon his death, presenting a possible financial motive for the crime. The credibility of Jacqueline's account was further questioned when details about the emergency call were analyzed. She claimed to have dialed the emergency services using a button phone with her tongue. While traces of her saliva were indeed found on the device, investigators noted during their initial inspection that the phone had been found face down on a coffee table, a position that conflicted with her tied-up state. This discrepancy added to the growing doubts about her version of events, suggesting that she might have staged the crime scene. The positioning of the phone raised further doubts about Jacqueline's account of the events. It was implausible for her to have turned the phone over after making the call if it was initially face down, as found at the crime scene. Moreover, a search of the couple's home computer history unearthed inquiries about life insurance policies, specifically regarding payout amounts and procedures following the policyholder's death, queries that had been made over several months. When confronted about these searches, Jacqueline feigned ignorance, suggesting that perhaps Paul had been the one interested in the information. Meanwhile, Roger Ferguson, also a suspect, seemed to have a solid alibi provided by his mother. She testified that he had spent the night at home feeling unwell and that she had been searching their medicine cabinet around 1:30 a.m. to find something for his stomach issues. Despite the mother's persuasive account, the police were not ready to exclude Roger from their list of suspects. Further investigation using cell phone signal tracking revealed discrepancies in his alibi. Roger had not been at home as claimed, but was instead at the Crimble residence for several hours on the night of the crime. Complicating matters, Roger continued his relationship with Jacqueline post the incident. They were spotted together at a bar the day after Paul's funeral, and later, both were seen at a car dealership. There, alongside Roger's mother, they inquired about purchasing an SUV on an installment plan, suggesting they were considering how to utilize the insurance payout. This behavior raised suspicions that Roger and Jacqueline, possibly with the knowledge of Roger's mother, had planned how they would use the funds following Paul's death. Despite these damning observations, during interrogations, Jacqueline maintained her innocence, claiming she had never been unfaithful to Paul nor wished him any harm. However, the mounting evidence and her lack of emotional response made it increasingly difficult for anyone to believe her. Shortly before the tragedy unfolded, Jacqueline had taken up a job as a caregiver in a nursing home. However, her tenure was brief, lasting only a few weeks before she was dismissed due to persistent conflicts and dishonesty. Yet, she concealed her termination from Paul, continuing to feign employment and claiming night shifts while she actually spent her time at Ferguson's house. This deceit came to light unexpectedly when Paul encountered one of Jacqueline's former colleagues, who disclosed the truth about her job situation. Attempting to confront Jacqueline led only to more strife. She threatened to leave him, take their children with her, and prevent Paul from having any contact with them. This threat struck at Paul's greatest fear, prompting him to reluctantly tolerate her infidelity to avoid losing his children. Paul confided these painful details only to his closest friend, who would later share this testimony in court. The development and execution of a devious plan Roger, though physically strong, was not particularly clever, and was somewhat naive and impressionable. Jacqueline capitalized on these traits, quickly gaining an upper hand in their relationship. She manipulated Roger into confronting anyone who crossed her, which significantly boosted her ego. Roger, likely genuinely in love, believed Jacqueline's every word uncritically. Jacqueline began fabricating stories about Paul, falsely accusing him of rudeness, cruelty, and even physical abuse. These lies, fed consistently to Roger, fueled his hatred towards Paul, whom he grew to see as a tyrant oppressing Jacqueline and obstructing their happiness. She planted the idea in Roger's mind that the only solution to their problems was the elimination of her husband. This, she suggested, would not only free them to be together, but also secure a substantial financial payout from Paul's life insurance, ensuring a comfortable future for them both. Approximately 2 weeks before the tragedy, Mrs. Krimble actively sought individuals who could be paid to commit the crime. However, after considering several options, she and Roger decided against hiring outsiders. It appeared they concluded they could execute the plan themselves more discreetly, thereby keeping all of the insurance money without leaving any witnesses or traceable evidence. On Friday, June 18th, Jacqueline arranged for the children to stay with their grandparents for the weekend, clearing the way for the upcoming events. The following day, she suggested to Paul that they go out for drinks, ostensibly to relax and talk. Paul, hopeful that this might improve their strained relationship, readily agreed, unaware of the fatal implications of the invitation. That evening, bar patrons observed Jacqueline aggressively encouraging her typically abstemious husband to drink excessively. She purchased multiple shots, coaxing him into consuming one after another, before eventually leading her visibly impaired husband out of the bar past midnight. This was the last time Paul was seen alive on surveillance footage. A significant timing discrepancy emerged from these events. The bar was only a 10-minute walk from their home, and Jacqueline claimed the attack happened almost immediately upon their return, lasting no more than 15 minutes. Following the supposed attack, she claimed her husband was abducted and driven away in their car, prompting her to call the police immediately. However, there was an unexplained hour-and-a-half gap between their appearance on camera and Jacqueline's emergency call. Investigators suspected that this interval was used by the culprits to meticulously cover their tracks and stage the crime scene to implicate unknown attackers. They also believed that Jacqueline had deliberately intoxicated her husband to weaken his ability to resist an assault. According to her account, the assailants physically assaulted Paul, then suffocated him with a plastic bag secured over his head with tape. While the nature of Paul's injuries aligned with her description, the police were increasingly convinced that Jacqueline and her lover, Roger Ferguson, were the true perpetrators. After a detailed examination of the crime scene, detectives discovered a partially erased footprint of a man's shoe, which appeared to have been clumsily cleaned. The tread pattern matched Roger's shoes, a piece of evidence that, while circumstantial, began to add weight to the case against him. However, more damning evidence soon surfaced. In the kitchen trash, investigators found a cigarette butt with Roger's saliva on it. Additionally, a partial fingerprint of his was detected on the cable tie that bound Jacqueline's hands, and his fingerprints were also found on the ties binding the deceased's hands and feet. Moreover, traces of sweat and oil from both lovers were identified on the bag used to suffocate the victim. The investigation also revealed another participant in the crime, a minor acquaintance of Roger named Colin Robinson. Roger had called him on the night of the attack, requesting help with an unspecified favor. Colin drove his car to the end of the street at Roger's behest and walked to the house to keep a low profile. Upon realizing the gravity of the situation, Colin attempted to flee, but Roger coerced him into staying by threatening him with a knife and forced him to assist in moving Paul's body to the car and loading it into the trunk. They then drove the car to a deserted area and abandoned it. Initially, Colin denied any involvement, but under pressure during a second interrogation, he broke down and confessed. The investigation spanned several months, during which time detectives gathered irrefutable evidence, interviewed all relevant witnesses, and secured a confession from the third participant. Nonetheless, the trial for these heinous acts did not commence until the spring of 2007, nearly 3 years after Paul Krimble's tragic death. On May 7th, 2007, Jacqueline and Roger were convicted of premeditated murder, driven by the motive to collect insurance money. The widow, Jacqueline, received a 20-year prison sentence, while her lover and accomplice Roger received an 18-year sentence. The young accomplice, Colin Robinson, was sentenced to 3 years for his role in assisting the criminals and attempting to cover up the truth. Roger's elderly mother was also held accountable for perjury and providing a false alibi for her son. However, due to her advanced age and serious health issues, she was sentenced to only a year of probation. Even from behind bars, Jacqueline continued to wreak havoc on her family. She harbored resentment towards those who did not support her during the trial, including personal acquaintances who were relieved at her incarceration. Her own mother expressed a sentiment that individuals like Jacqueline should be permanently isolated from society to prevent further harm. In a spiteful act shortly after the funeral, Jacqueline destroyed all of her late husband's belongings and photos, attempting to erase every memory of him from their home. However, her daughter Danielle managed to secretly preserve a few photographs of her father, which she kept hidden in her bedside table, unbeknownst to her mother. The insurance money, amounting to £300,000, which was the motive behind Paul's murder, was rightfully inherited by his children, Danielle and Adam. However, the siblings faced continued turmoil. Jacqueline fiercely opposed the idea of either her own parents or her late husband's parents raising the children, effectively ensuring that Danielle and Adam were placed in foster care despite having living grandparents. At the time of their father's murder, Danielle was only 11 and her brother Adam was just 5 years old. Jacqueline maintained her parental rights from prison and tried to manipulate her children. She used various tactics to coerce them into proclaiming her innocence publicly, such as promising to sign permission slips for school trips if they visited her. Yet she reneged on these promises during their visits, demanding that they testify in her favor instead, and ultimately not signing the permission slips, which resulted in them missing out on school activities. Now Danielle is 31, living in Basingstoke, working at a daycare, and is in a relationship with Simon Bryce, an engineer. Her brother Adam, now 25, has moved to London and pursued a successful education. With Jacqueline's impending release next year, both siblings are deeply concerned that their mother will resume her efforts to disrupt their lives.